So I made a tier list of all the campaign opponents in this game where I showed off their deck list, talked about their strategy, and ranked them from worst to best. And I actually talked a decent amount of trash about many fan favorite archetypes, including Elemental Heroes, the Batteryman, and Skull Servants, who all ended up at the bottom of my list. However, this evaluation was heavily dependent on PvE experience inside the vacuum that is this game, and also factored in the ability of the AI to pilot the deck against you, the player. So in order to further evaluate if these decks were really as bad as I said they were, I thought it'd be fun to throw together a ROM hack where we take the 6 lowest ranked enemies and make their decks available as starting deck choices, so we can see how they match up against the early opponents in this game, which will give us an even better idea of their overall power level. And to make it more interesting, I went and removed the starter deck, which means that you really have to incorporate the original themes going forward, although I was nice and left 3000 DP just in case you wanted to buy some stuff on day one. But of course, you can't roleplay as a computer without your special CPU icon, which are all here for these 6 respective starting deck choices. Each of these decks have really unique themes, wonderful pixel art, and are of course ranked from worst to best as they appeared in my video. So with that, let's just go one by one, check out the decks again, and touch on what it's like to use them from a human perspective. The first and alleged worst deck we're going to look at is Elemental Hero Electrum's High Rise Hero deck. I mostly rated this deck so low because the fusions leave a lot of room for going negative in card advantage, which makes it pretty easy to beat as a player. The AI also doesn't make the best decisions and loves to attack into full back row, so pretty much any form of removal, including return effects, are usually instant blowouts against this duelist. Now, as a player using this deck, I did have a lot of similar thoughts to what I said in my original video, but I will reiterate that Skyscraper is basically the best card in this deck and makes any basic hero monster into a powerful one-way beat stick. And if you can play more monsters than your opponent, then you're usually going to win the long game, and there's a few monster recovery cards that you can use which really help that strategy along. And while we do have a ton of elemental heroes on the first day, there are many combinations of heroes that don't fuse together, so you'll probably often find yourself without a proper fusion target, which will unfortunately leave all of the polymerizations and fusion recoveries stuck in your hand and make for many dead draws off the top of the deck, which is one of the things that really hurts this deck. So yeah, this deck struggles a little bit, and it does have a few bricks, which definitely deserves to be on the bottom of the tier list, but I was actually so amazed by how fun this deck is to play, especially in a format like this where there isn't a whole lot of fusion summoning, and doing extra deck stuff is just extremely satisfying, and it's even more satisfying to win because you really stick to the strategy, and I just highly recommend playing this deck for a little bit. And oh yeah, the last thing you need to know is that there is no function for distributing fusion cards in the starting deck, so they're going to end up in your main deck section whenever you start a new game. And this kind of seems cool at first, but if you end up drawing these cards during a no more duel, then they instantly disappear, which means you have a high chance of skipping your draw phase or even starting with less than 5 cards in your hand, so be sure to go and move these to the trunk and then move them to the fusion deck before dueling. So the next deck we're going to look at is what I called the second worst opponent in the game, but it's actually the first opponent in campaign mode, and that's Kuriboh's Kuriboh and Friends. However, this is far from a Kuriboh deck. It's actually more of an anime deck, as it uses a blend of Yugi, Kaiba, and Joey's anime monsters, and it even has some of the classics like Mystical Elf, Lajin, and Giant Soldier of Stone. The boss monsters are also classic, of course, but get outclassed by simple things like Summon Skull and Zaborg the Thunder Monarch, so it's not that great, but besides the tributes, the monster lineup really isn't that bad. Even the spells and traps aren't even the worst I've ever seen. Really just the bunch of Kuriboh cards is what kind of holds the deck back. Flute of Summon Kuriboh is actually a fairly decent card in the right circumstances. It can ruin dust tornadoes and heavy storms, and it can even special summon a monster for a really quick tribute in a monarch deck, but hard drawing a Kuriboh at any point during the game is usually just terrible. And you know, I'm really not sure why they didn't go with a full-on Kuriboh deck. There's not too many Kuriboh cards, but there is Wing Kuriboh level 10 and Transcendent Wings, which do make an appearance later on in one of the theme duels, so the AI is equipped to handle it, but that deck is sort of just a weird version of the level 1 deck, so it doesn't really put any emphasis on the Kuriboh strategy, and possibly a little bit of a missed opportunity. And most of the deck actually makes sense, like more Kaiba cards like Gemini Elf and Vorse Raider, but somehow Man-Eater Bug and Barrel Dragon ended up in the deck, so who knows with this one. Either way, the original Kuriboh deck ended up being way stronger than I had expected, and the AI really holds it back because it just doesn't have a lot of discretion, so you really need to conserve your equip spells, and you need to save your better monsters before you commit them to the board, because if you can bait your opponent into using the removal spells on the bad stuff, then you can come in later with the Mahavelio and the Axe of Despair, and pretty much answer any big monsters to close out the game quickly. But yeah, other than conserving your monsters and spells, there's not a whole lot to playing this deck. I think the most technical it gets is there's a few combat tricks that you can do in the damage step, so there is a few things you can do, but mostly it's just very one-dimensional beatdown deck. So yeah, it's not the most spicy, and the upgrade options aren't the most spicy either, because you're either becoming a more generic beatdown deck, or you have to start steering heavily into Kuriboh, Wing Kuriboh, you know, level 10 type stuff. So this deck is definitely stronger at the beginning of the game, but might scale worse throughout a playthrough, so could be a pretty interesting deck to use. Now the third deck that's available is Helio Duis Magistes Final Frontier deck. This is a Helios DD themed deck that of course focuses on banishing cards from anywhere in order to power up your boss monsters like Grand Maju, Golden Homunculus, and the 3 Helioses. There's even a decent amount of meta cards in this build that fit in seamlessly, like Nobleman of Crossout, Bottomless Trap Hole, and DD Warrior, Warrior Lady, and Assailant. There's even a chance to pull off a really neat DD Survivor and Banisher of the Light combo, which will pretty much give you a monster that can't be killed, or it can be tributed infinitely or something like that. But where this deck really shines is in the late game, where you'll be dropping huge beat sticks off a normal summon, as you'll have a decent amount of bandage cards built up. The big Helioses even have this cool effect where if they get beat down and sent to the graveyard, then they come back to play with even more attack, so that's really neat. Although one issue with this is you pretty much always want a Banisher of Light in play, because it's going to maximize how big your Grand Maju and your Golden Homunculus is going to be, but unfortunately if he's in play, then the Helioses won't get their reviving effect, so you pretty much always want a Banisher in play until you don't, so that's a little bit of a conflict. And the other thing I noticed is that it runs things like Magician of Faith and Call the Haunted. I don't know, there's a few things that conflict in this deck. If it can just be streamlined a little bit more, I think it would be incredible. Because whenever you do drop that big Grand Maju or big Golden Homunculus, it feels good. Like, it feels really good to just beat someone down with a huge beat stick. Honestly, I really enjoyed playing this deck, and it's actually one of the harder decks to play because you're always trying to maximize, you know, your banish cards and where they're going and stuff like that. So you have to really order things in the right order to capitalize on all the, you know, weird monster effects. So it's definitely really satisfying to play, and whenever you win, because again, you have to stick to the true theme and you don't really stray off of it and play like a weird obscure beatdown. I definitely enjoyed this. It seems a little bit overpowered for a starting deck in terms of like a card cost, you know, like from a day one pack ripping standpoint, but surprisingly the power level really matches up perfectly with the beginning opponents and scales really well throughout the playthrough, so it's probably one of my favorite decks from this hack. And honestly, this sun's kind of looking like a snack right now. Now the fourth deck was another good farm target, and that's Batteryman C in level 2. This is actually a really interesting machine deck that tries to pull off a bunch of little combos to try to generate a big machine monster that it basically just beats you down with. It mainly wants to battery charge a Batteryman A into Inferno Reckless Summon, so it can quickly build up a board with 3,000 attack points monsters, which is sometimes good enough to OTK you. And the other small combo it can do is bringing out Ancient Gear Golem ahead of schedule with the Trojan horses, which generally gives the opponent 2 draw steps to find an answer before they get pierced to death. And this is just a mid to late game bomb that can sometimes get the job done on its own. And on paper, this deck really isn't too bad at all. It even has meta cards like Cyber Dragon and Droroid, but unfortunately, this was another one of those where the AI really holds it back because it struggles with timing and playing around defensive effects. It also has this issue where the normal summons are extremely underwhelming in most cases. There's only one 1850 attack point monster, 3 1600 attack point monsters, and everything else is under 1,000, which is insanely low considering the era we're in. The other tiny issue with this deck is the combos are pretty good, but usually not that great. For instance, like I said before, the Inferno Reckless Summon Batteryman A combo is sometimes good enough to kill you, but it's generally not. And if you could deal with just one of the Batterymen, then it's way easier to deal with the other two, so it's a pretty vulnerable board setup. My last little gripe with this deck is that it has 2 copies of Rollout, and there's only 2 Union monsters in the whole deck, so you're pretty much just asking for dead draws, and these have got to come out immediately. But overall, I really enjoyed playing this, obscure machine aggro combo deck. There's a ton of room for potential upgrades in whatever direction. I mean, you could add in more gyroids, which could survive a turn to add more tributes. You could add in more Trojan horses and Ancient Gear Golems over the Perfect Machine King or whatever. There's just a ton of cool options, and the base is really good for upgrading. It has some cool tech cards like Rare Metamorph, which can be a damage step thing, or it can block like a Snatch Steal, so there's just really good options, and that combined with how the power level isn't too way high above the early opponents make playing this deck just enough of a challenge and makes the games really interesting and the wins satisfying. So if you're only going to pick a few of these decks to play, I'd definitely consider this to be one of them. Now the 5th deck is definitely the cutest of them all because it's White Magician Pikaru's Friendship from the Magic Land. This name is actually so long, it exceeds the length of deck name that we're supposed to follow, so she's already literally cheating. But besides the name, this deck really does have a lot going on. I consider it mostly a control deck with a few aggro cards in it. It's got like Toon Gemini Elf and Injection Fairy Lily, but it has a lot of utility monsters, and things like Apprentice Magician really serve the deck well. It can search for either Princess, Magician of Faith, or the Unhappy Girl, which I didn't even realize how good the Unhappy Girl is in this deck. She's the one who can't be destroyed in battle as long as she's in attack mode. Then any monster she battles can't change its battle position or attack as long as she stays in attack mode. So this is basically a mini Thousand Eyes Restrict floodgate effect that clogs up your opponent's board and goes along perfect with the effect of either Princess. This card's actually even better as a player because the AI loves to target it for an attack target because it tries to deal the most battle damage as possible, so it pretty much instantly protects any other monster you have, and simply by itself, it might even allow the Silent Magician to stick around for 5 turns and evolve into a Silent Mommy Magician. Although something I didn't originally catch with this deck is Trial of the Princess is way more situational than I thought it was. It's only able to special summon the big princess if the little princess beats down a level 5 or higher monster while equipped with the card, and on top of that, the big princesses can't be special summoned from the graveyard, only from the hand or deck, which makes it even worse. So I don't even know what to say. They can't be normal summoned or special summoned regardless, which pretty much makes them a solid brick at all times. But I'd say the even more frustrating thing about this deck is that the princess effects get the most utility whenever they're in a stall burn type deck, and not really decks that have anything aggressive to do with it that beat down any monsters. It usually just wants to clog up the board as much as possible, so it has a little bit of an identity crisis, and you either need to become more stall or abandon the princess strategy to become more aggro, which takes a while to fill out the deck in either direction. I personally decided to become a stalling scumbag and build a deck that integrates Spirit Barrier to diminish the negative effects of Unhappy Girl, and added more Apprentice Magicians and a couple of Shining Angels to make it even more searchable. I also brought in Astral Barrier and threw in Cat of Ill Omens to make the combo more consistent by making it even more searchable, and truly this allows you to win with the original strategy and be the Nichan that you've always wanted to be. That's going to bring us to the final starting deck choice, which is another fan favorite of new and old, Skull Servant. This is a pretty unique zombie stall deck that basically tries to fill up the graveyard with Skull Servants and King of the Skull Servants so that you can eventually drop a huge King of the Skull Servants that will eventually take over the board and beat everything down once you're ready to be aggressive. And surprisingly, this obscure zombie strategy synergizes really well with all the stall support cards like Level Limit and Gravity Bind, because King is a level 3 and can start swinging underneath these effects. Spirit Reaper can also swing underneath these effects once King has cleared the way, and even Des Lakuta will give you extra cards while everything is locked down. In my opinion, what makes the deck really enjoyable to play is that it's super consistent at executing its strategy, and even the random one-ofs in this deck are super fun to use. There's really not a whole lot of decks like it, and there's plenty of room to upgrade it, so this deck just has a lot of cool things going on. I think the only thing I didn't like about the deck is that King of the Skull Servants can only be revived if destroyed in battle, which is usually the least likely way he's gonna die, so that sort of takes away from the epic boss monsterness. And the other thing I didn't like is, while most of the time you do close it out with a King of the Skull Servants, every once in a while you just stealth bird your opponent 8 times for the win, which isn't the most interactive or engaging, but I guess is better than losing, so there is that. And oh yeah, I found this random bug where you can't search King of the Skull Servants off of Sangan. I'm pretty sure you can search it off of other stuffs, but for this specific effect or the way it's worded or something, it just doesn't work, which is actually situationally really bad, but you know, probably not going to happen that often considering Sangan's a one-of. But despite all these issues, this deck is actually maybe a little bit too good for a new playthrough of this game. It doesn't have many bad cards at all, and it can actually survive without stall effects because of the stone statues, stealth birds, and spirit reapers. On top of that, it's got 2 reloads, so you're probably going to find a pretty good defensive effect sooner or later, and it's going to make it pretty consistent at defeating these computers. So I'd say this deck definitely deserved to be at the height of this list. So yeah, that's all of them, and honestly I was really surprised by my playthrough experience, and I actually think I'd modify where I'd place these decks on a tier list going forward. I think Kuriboh's deck is probably a little bit stronger than I expected and is probably better than the Helios deck, and while I do think Batteryman is still one of the fastest opponents to beat, there's at least a chance you'll get OTK'd, which I think deserves to be moved up a spot, which is perfect because I'm semi-convinced that White Magician Pikaru and Kuriboh are essentially near tied in power level, so that's pretty much where stuff ended up for me. And I hope you end up doing stuff for me, because I'm out here grinding these classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Handhelds. I haven't even eaten since my last upload, so be sure to click all the things, and also be sure to leave me some votes in the comments for stuff that you want to see in the future. I'll be posted up here producing another high quality cinematic experience, or I'll be posted at the stoplight begging for money.